Okay, I want to get started. Good morning. Hi, everybody. So thanks for joining. I'll give you a little brief overview of who I am and why I'm talking about diversity, because if you look at me, you'd probably be like, seriously? So let me just give you some context. So my name is Melissa Jurkoic. I actually am the Chief Experience Officer of a startup. It's a hospitality SaaS company. They're actually started in Belgium. So there's a lot of diversity there, by the way, because I work with people all over the world. I also co-founded an initiative called Diversify Thinking. Diversify Thinking is an initiative that my co-founders and I brought together because we had participated in a lot of initiatives, communities, et cetera, ERGs, you name it, all the different acronyms, really around diversity and inclusion for years. And we did it really locally, nationally, and globally, and it was frustrating because we felt like we were having the same conversations for decades, arguably. And that was a bit frustrating because we didn't feel like we were actually making any forward-moving progress. So our idea with Diversify Thinking was to bring more people around the table. We had really focused around women in tech. So you can see that's sort of what I represent. I've been a female technologist for well over 25 years. Dating myself, yes, but it's true. I'm very proud of it, actually. And what I realize is being the only person in the room representing a particular demographic dimension of diversity is really, really tough. And it's tough to make stuff like that change. So diversified thinking for us is really to try to level up the level of conversation we have with the level of action that we don't feel like we've been taking. So that's why I'm really passionate about this topic. So my hope is, I come to tech conferences, I've done speeches like this quite a bit, and really, I give people a break from code. I'm really excited about the fact that CodeCamp does this quite a bit. Not all tech conferences do that. So I applaud all of you for making time to come to this talk, because I'm not gonna show any code in this talk. I may reference technology because that is obviously my background, but this is the hard stuff. I did a post when I was heading out here. I'm based in New Hampshire in the northeast of the United States, and one of the things I said was I love doing these talks because it really helps people to think differently. And we heard this morning, right, like this is all about diversity of thought. So please ask questions. My hope is that I take something that might be a little bit overwhelming and make it more like level the playing field so we're all speaking the same language and that we feel like maybe we can take some action together leaving this room. So that's a little bit about me and why I'm here and super passionate about this. So how many people are, let's just say, overwhelmed by the topic of diversity, equity, inclusion, and all the different acronyms that we've created around it? I mean, I am. I'm up here talking to you about it. I've talked about it several times. It can be super overwhelming. That's okay. I think the first step is just acknowledge it. It's a lot. So what I like is I love this definition. Part of it is because diversified thinking really is focused around diversity of thought, regardless of who you are, your background, your experience, who you represent as far as a dimension of diversity. So I love this quote by Malcolm Forbes because it really strips away all of those things that make us really uncomfortable, nervous, worried about taking action and speaking, and worried about offending people. And it really just talks about our brains. So really, for me, and I truly believe this, that diversity is the art of thinking independently together. And if you think about that, no pun intended, it's really, really powerful, because what it's saying is it doesn't matter what color your skin is, what your gender is, how old you are, what sort of maybe neurodiverse factors you have going on in your life, your past experience, your employment, your skills, your degree, whatever. Doesn't matter. We all have something unique, and it's the way we think. It's our perspective, which we also heard about in the keynote this morning, right? So our perspective and all of those different things coming together is when, I always say, is when the magic happens. So I'm a big fan of conflict and chaos. That may sound crazy. The reason why is because I don't believe that true innovation comes from everyone nodding around a table. It just doesn't happen. I've worked at companies like that. It's very boring. So that's why the art of thinking independently together means everyone's coming around the table, everybody has a seat, everybody has a voice, and we all have our own opinions. And sometimes they're not the same. And that's the beauty of it all. So with that definition, I like to take you on a journey for the next, I guess, probably like 30, 40 minutes together, and talk about how do we approach this? Because I think that people do get overwhelmed, like we all admitted that in the room. So where do we start? And people will ask me often, like, where do we start? I had a colleague that I had met through several different organizations that I worked with, and he called me. He was the chief operating officer at a startup locally where I live. And he called me and he's like, Melissa, I have a problem. And I was like, cool. how can I help? And he said, I'm sitting in a leadership team meeting this morning, and I looked around the table, and everyone that I was talking to looked like me. And I said, well, not surprising. You live in New Hampshire. It happens to be one of the whitest states in the country. And you're hiring people that are male and roughly around your age. And he said, I don't think this startup is going to survive. And I was like, well, first of all, congratulations for recognizing that you're participating in groupthink, sitting around the table in your leadership team meetings, and something has to change. And he's like, I don't know where to start. And this I find is like really from a leadership level, people genuinely want to do like the altruistic thing, but also see that there's business benefits. And hopefully I can highlight some of those for you today. But they don't know where to start. So what I try to say is the first step in the journey is to define diversity in your context. That is a big idea. And what I'm trying to say there is, there's no wrong answer. This is where people get really overwhelmed, right? Like think about all the different dimensions of diversity, and that's what I like to call them. There's neurodiversity, like how do we all think? You know, whether it's you're on the autism spectrum or you have some level of anxiety disorder, those are aspects of diversity that we don't talk about a lot, right? Like the whole idea of mental health, that matters. Well, how people learn, how people receive information is part of diversity. Your age and gender, and metrics I'll show you today, are really focused around age and gender. It's not because it's what I think is the most important, by the way. It's because that's what we report on. So all of the studies that you'll read in Harvard Business Review and McKinsey, they focus heavily on age and gender. Why is that? Does anyone know? It's the easiest things to measure. Exactly right, right? It's what we see. And I love to say, I heard this quote at a conference I went to once before, and I just loved it. It really stuck with me. And the gentleman said, diversity is what you see without a conversation. And I was like, wow, that really stuck with me. And part of that is I have 2 autistic nieces, which is also very rare, right? It's 2 girls in the same family, sisters, that are both autistic. The odds are very low that ever happens. What's interesting about them is they're both autistic, but both very different in terms of where they are on the spectrum. And if you saw them walking down the street, you know, right now they're almost 20 and 21. And if you saw them walking down the street, you would be like, oh, there's 2, you know, early 20s female. You would never even understand unless you had a conversation with them. And then you'd realize, okay, there's something a little bit different about how they perceive the world, how they communicate, their level of dialogue with you. But like again, diversity is what you see without a conversation. So exactly right, we measure things like even age, right? We measure age, gender, and ethnicity, and we do all of that, and then we report on it, and then people forget about all the other dimensions of diversity. So I want to bring that back to the table today because I think it's really important. Even like personality, like Myers-Briggs and all those tests you can take, that's part of diversity. Like having all of that different perspective around the table really does matter. So you have to define that in your context. For me, I've always been representative of a female in tech, and I think that's promoted and really, you know, positioned me to do a lot of work in that area. So it's very important to me. It's not the only thing that's important to me, but I admit that when I define diversity in my context, that's sort of where I prioritize things, like how can I promote diversity in tech, specifically in the space of making more space for women in leadership roles especially. So that's my context. But what is it in your context? You know, whether you're in a startup, the quote and the way that I talk about this is really around startups, and the reason why is because it's a lot easier to do this in a startup because you're just starting, the nature of the name. It's harder when you're part of a larger corporation, but it's not less important, and it's not impossible, but it is harder, right? Because at that point, it's been happening for a while. So you have to define diversity in your context. So that's your first step, and think about that. And I challenge all of you, regardless of what your role is in your organization, you can influence change here. You can have conversations, you can start grassroots initiatives, regardless of the size of your team, your corporation, you know, whatever your context is, you can make change, but you have to define what that is. Where I got this particular t-shirt was at a global event around women in tech, and it's from NYU, and their goal was to be 50-50 gender diverse by 2025. Again, like they were very clear, right? They were clear with how they define diversity in their context. Doesn't mean it was wrong. It doesn't mean they didn't care about race or age or, neurodiversity. It means they picked a path and they said, I'm going to put this milestone in the ground and I'm going to try to meet this by 2025. And I think that's what's important. Just like anything in business, you have to pick your target and plan accordingly. If we just say, we're going to be more diverse, I don't even know what that means. Like, what does that mean? How are you going to succeed? So define diversity in your context based on all the different dimensions, and then define what those goals are for wherever you are. Don't accrue diversity debt. So are you all technologists in the room at some level? Yeah? So you guys know technical debt, right? We love technical debt, don't we? So again, I was an engineer for well over 13 years. I will say I helped accrue some technical debt in my time. We all do. It doesn't mean we're bad people. It doesn't mean like we're not careless. Maybe some are, but we're not careless generally, right? Like we want to do the right thing. We want to build things that are sustainable, that like we leave a legacy behind. They have longevity behind us. We're not trying to do bad things, right? Why do we have technical debt? Anybody have any ideas of why we have technical debt? That's right, because we cut corners. That's true in a lot of things in life, right? Like we cut corners and we make decisions based on what's ahead of us, right? Like maybe there's a deadline and the executive sponsor is saying you got to get it done, and we're like, well, crap, to do it the right way, it's going to take about 9 months. To get it done, in 3 months, we're going to have to do it this way, and no one loves that, but we will get it done, right? So there's business stakeholders. The same thing happens with diversity, right? And that's why I always say, like, with startups or small companies, you're able to achieve things more intentionally, and intention is a word I use a lot, like, because you can, and you don't have as much pressure to grow the team as fast or to hire things. Like, you're able to make better decisions. I will say a big challenge in startups, and I've experienced this with the last couple that I've joined, startups generally start by hiring friends and family, right? Because it's easy, because you can convince people that really care about you that you should join the journey, because maybe you can't pay them enough right away, or maybe they'll just believe in you. So the challenge with that is if you keep on that path as a startup, what you'll get is a lot of people that look like you, a lot of people that you're comfortable being around, because we as human beings, again, we're not bad people, but we tend to hire and promote and grow people that we're comfortable working with, because we don't like to be uncomfortable. But remember what I said, when we're not uncomfortable, we don't get the beauty of the magic of all these awesome things happening, because there's conflict. Because when we're comfortable and we all get along, there's no conflict. So if you define diversity in your context, the next question I always get is like, well, when do we start? And I'm like, well, you're already late. Like, sorry, but you're already late. You should have started right in the beginning. But understandably, people don't, right? Because I just told you, startups generally grow through friends and family. So you have to recognize that you haven't started, and you have to create a path to do that. And don't accrue the debt, because it's really hard, right? Like, again, large companies, it's not impossible, and I've seen people make a lot of headway doing that, but it's harder. So if you are part of a small team within a large company or part of a smaller company, the time is now. So you leave this room and you're like, all right, I got to define diversity in my context, and then I got to figure out how we start to act on this. So take action now, because it will serve you for years and years to come, and it honestly catches fire. Like, it becomes habitual. And I can attest to that in my current state where I work. My company is global. We are all remote. By the way, how many people work remote? Okay, so about half of you. It's even harder to increase diversity as a globally remote company. I'm sorry to say, even as a startup. It takes a lot more intention, right? Because now you're hiring people that you might never even meet in person. And you're hiring them definitely before you meet them in person. I just hired 3 people in Europe, and I just met them for the first time 2 weeks ago. I flew to Amsterdam so we could all come together. But I hadn't met them. I had conversations, but conversations over Google Meet, it's really tough, right? Like, you got to really dig deep and try to figure out who these people are, what makes them tick, and really understand, am I building a diverse team? Which I'm really passionate about, right? But like, it takes intention, it's hard work, but it's not impossible. And now that I've started to influence our organization, because we're pretty young, When I joined, we were about 17 employees. Now we're over 50. That was less than 2 years ago. So we're growing rapidly, and I'm influencing diverse recruiting practices and just that intentionality. So it's very possible, and now I hear people using words and acting in a way where, well, we shouldn't hire that person yet, because we should make sure that we have enough people that we're comparing against. And I was like, okay, this is good stuff. So it's very possible, proof positive. I can tell you standing here that it works, but you have to like have that intention and just admit that if you don't start today, you're gonna accrue debt, and it just gets harder. So now you have your definition. You know you need to start yesterday because you're already late. So where do you start? At the top, of course. And this is even harder because especially with startups, most of the time you already have at least 1 or 2 founders. I find in my experience, the majority of them happen to be male. Nothing wrong with that, just saying, it's true. Data shows me the same. And therefore, now you have to look at, okay, well, if I'm growing the leadership team, do I grow the team of doers? Do I grow the leaders? How do I do this? This is a big challenge, especially for small companies, right? Because I will tell you that the conversations we have sometimes around the leadership, and when I got hired, it was like, is this person overhead? Or is this person going to like deliver value? So in a startup, you kind of have to be both, right? Like even at the leadership level, you have to be able to get your hands dirty and do those things. So you have to start at the top. Why is that important? There's 3 different audiences that matter by diversifying your leadership team. It's not just because it's like the best thing to do, like we're being good people. There's actually true business benefit. The first, especially for startups, again in that context, is your investors, right? So there's a lot of studies out there. McKinsey does a lot of these studies that have a lot of data that says, you know, women-founded companies are like the least invested, like they don't get as much investor information, dollars, et cetera. What I've seen in studies that I've looked at, again, across several different sources, is if you have at least 1 female founder, not enough to entire female development, leadership team, but at least 1, they're about 63% more likely to get funded. Now, if you level up to 65%, by having an ethnically diverse leadership team. So not just gender diverse, but again, gender and race, right? I promised you that most of the statistics were gonna be based there. So then it ups from 63 to 65% more likely to be funded. So these are data points, right? Like that matters to your business. So that's investors are looking at that. And because good investors understand that diverse leadership leads to great things and innovation. So you are more likely to get funding if you have some level of diverse leadership. And that's a little bit contradictory to some of the studies that you see where, you know, again, like female-founded companies are some of the least funded. But again, I think it's kind of looking at, that's saying like solely female leadership teams, where this is saying a diverse team where there's a blend. Again, so that's a big difference, and I think also really important. So that's one, like the investor community, right? How you're getting funded if you're a startup. The second is your customers. For the women in the room, how likely would you be to buy something that was a female targeted product from a company that was led by men? No, right? Why would you do that? You'd be like, yeah, because you know me, right? It doesn't make sense, right? So you're appealing to your target audience, your target market. That stuff matters. Like when I buy products, especially now, right? Like I think this has shifted quite a bit in the last 5 years as well. Like I think we're all from a consumer perspective, and even when we, you know, working with partnering with businesses and et cetera, we look at who's running that company. You know, do we trust them? Do we believe that they know who we are? Like if I'm their target market, do I feel like they even know their target market? This stuff matters, so it does attract customers. How diverse your leadership team is. People are going on your website and they're looking at who your leadership team is. So that's a whole nother audience, right? Like if you want to be relatable to the markets you're trying to sell to. Again, this isn't about just being, you know, altruistic. This is about like true business. And they've done a ton of studies around that, like in focus groups. And you know, the question I just asked was like, obviously, it was a high-level question for the women in the room. But they've done these things, and people are less likely to buy from a company that they don't feel like they can relate to, or they don't trust. And you see this, right? You see this in industry when someone does something that is sort of a little bit like, and didn't Pepsi or somebody did something recently and everyone went, oh, I'm gonna not buy Pepsi or whatever for a while, right? Like, I think we see it has a dramatic impact, like when there are decisions made on the business side that we don't relate to, right? They don't resonate with us, then we're just like, yeah, we're just gonna step away from you, your brand, for a little bit because we don't like what you did. So this really matters. And then there's a third audience that also matters. And this matters a lot for a startup, again, because especially if you're in the stage of growth like we are with the company I work with, who you attract for talent. So I don't know about you, but when I look at potential roles and where I'm going for my next opportunity, I always look at the leadership team. I would never even entertain an interview if I didn't know who was leading that organization, regardless of what role, right? I look at this too when we're partnering with companies. I'm responsible for partnerships at my organization, and when we partner with companies, I look at the leadership team. Because it tells me a lot about what's important to that company and how they're making decisions. And again, that's like high-level data, right? Remember, because diversity is what you see without a conversation. But it's the only data I have. I mean, what else can I go after? So this stuff matters, like how you're promoting your company out to the world. Again, it's going to look at your investors, your target market, and employees, your future employees. They are looking at who you are and how your company is making decisions to understand, could I work there? Is this something that I feel like I could believe in? So similar to, could I buy their products? Do I want to be part of what they're delivering? So these three audiences are really important. So you're going to define in your context. You're going to start right away because you already are behind, and you're going to start at the top because of all the reasons why I just shared with you. So if we talk about, there's two areas of diversity that I think we focus on a lot. One in particular, and there's all sorts of resources. There's whole companies that have been born to help with this exact problem, which is diverse recruiting, which is, again, it's difficult. So it's important, but it's not just that. You also have to look at retention, which we'll talk about in just a second. So how many people have heard of like these decoders? Have you guys ever heard of this, gender decoder? I'll tell you a story about this particular one. This one's actually free. There's several others. I've had people tell me in the past that there's some that are specific to racial decoding as well. This is an interesting story that we had at one of the startups I worked at a few years ago. So we were hiring for, it was a technical project management position. We put out there, and again, two things that we did. As a startup, we kept our job descriptions very light, like maybe a couple paragraphs, sort of like leave some things to the imagination. Don't have like 3 pages, and I'll get into that in a second why that's really important, especially on the factor of gender. And just kind of leave it open for interpretation. That sometimes scares people, but it also is, we all just know in startups, your role is likely going to fluctuate a little bit. We might ask you to stretch in one direction or the other. And we have a general idea of the type of person we're looking for and the skills and experience that we need, but maybe the actual like bucketed title and role could be flexible. So it represents flexibility. So that's what we did. So our job descriptions were super light, very like open. They were also written by a woman and reviewed by another woman. That was me. We posted this job description, and we got, probably like, I think, 100 plus candidates. 98% of them were men. I was like, for real? What's happening? So we took a look at that, and so the woman that was running People Ops at the time said, I want to run this decoder on this. And I was like, yeah, but like you wrote it, you're a woman. I read it and reviewed it. I'm a woman. There's hardly any words in it. It's not even like a really detailed job description. How masculine could it be? Well, I'll tell you, it was very masculine. The English language apparently is very masculine. So the gender decoder picked up on all sorts of like nuances, right down to like the title that we used. And that the fact that we put technical in the title was really like pushing away audience members that were not male. And I was like, well, that just sucks. So we changed it. I was like, okay, well, this will be an experiment. So we changed it. We reposted the role, and we got 11% more females that applied within a week. I was like, okay, this stuff works. So I mean, again, like that's a free decoder. You can do that against anything. Like, look at your website too, right? Like, the information and the way that you talk on your website matters. And that COO that I talked about, he actually went and ran this decoder and changed all of their content and copy on their website because he's like, it was so male. He's like, it was like crazy. And he did that, and he ended up hiring like 2 women on the leadership team within like 6 months of doing that, and like big results. And it seems so silly, right? Like, these are just words, but words really matter. And we have all this bias that we carry around and we don't even realize. So again, sorry, I keep speaking to the women in the room, but for the women in the room, how many times have you looked at a job, say it has 10 requirements that you're supposed to fit, right? You're looking at this position, you read all 10, and you look at them and you're like, you have 9 of the 10. You're like, oh yeah, solid, got this. You get to the 10th and you're like, oh, I've never done this. Guess I can't apply. I've done that. Anyone else? Yeah? So, I've told men this story. I've talked to men, they're like, what? Because and you guys can all attest this, they will look at that same job description with the 10 requirements, and they may have done 1 or 2, and they will look at the other 8 and go, I'll figure it out. And they will apply anyway. So again, this is true, right? Like, it's just, I'm not making this up. And I tell this story, but I tell you, I'll still do it. Like, it's a embedded societal bias that we just have, and it's very ingrained. So this is a reality. So what does that mean for you trying to hire? Well, if you want to encourage more diversity in your team, especially if you're trying to encourage more females to apply for your roles, don't make them 3 pages long with 100 requirements of what they need to be and do, because even a woman that has 90% of them isn't going to apply. And this, again, that's a huge stereotypical categorization, but I think it's mostly true. Like, I've told that story multiple times, and a lot of the women have been like, yeah, and I admit it, I do it too, and I think we can't help it. So as employers, when you're looking at your recruiting practices, that's a big thing you can do, and it's not hard. It's like, I think startups have it right because they do keep it light, and that does help. But again, language is a big thing. So like, decoding job descriptions, paying attention, being intentional about, and saying, who am I attracting with this role? If it's a 3-page job description, I promise you're not attracting me. And I think a few other women in the room would agree. Like, so just know, like, that stuff really does matter. So I think those are just some like things you can, again, like, leave here today and immediately do, like, following this talk. One of the other things I heard recently on a panel that I spoke at, the woman said she, in her organization, they do a blind review of resumes, which I thought was actually quite brilliant, right? They take away the person. So you don't know anything. You don't know what ethnicity, you don't know what gender, nothing. You're just like, here's who this person is on paper, which is really hard anyways, like looking at someone on paper. And you look at that, and then they make sure they have 5 people. And they do a similar thing in interviews so that they're trying to essentially remove bias from the process. And I thought that was really good. Like, it's really exceptional, because the problem with, I have to say AI, right? Because like you can't have a talk today in this world without at least saying AI, so I'm just saying it. So, but the problem is, honestly, with AI, and there's a lot of talk, is the fact that, even on LinkedIn, et cetera, it screens you out of roles. It doesn't even, by the way, I don't know if you guys know this, but it doesn't even show you roles. There's algorithms that are just working against us right now, right? And again, like, AI, but that's what it's doing, right? So it's looking at things in your history, and it's promoting things to you that it believes you're qualified for. I was like, don't do that work for me. I have a hard enough time already. Like, I just told you, I see something and I only qualify for 9 out of 10 things that I don't apply. I don't need a machine to make even worse decisions for me. But that's happening. So like, we have to be really intentional about that, especially if we want to encourage diversity, because the technology isn't. It's sort of working against us. So super important for us to do that. And again, like, start to think about diverse recruiting practices. I think it's surprising to people that when you keep a diverse pipeline for a role, that sometime, and again, it seems like intentional, and almost forceful, but sometimes the right candidate that you end up hiring is the most diverse candidate. I worked for, that same startup I worked for was a husband and wife co-founding group. I could talk to you a while about why that's a bad idea to join an organization like that, but that's a different story. So what was interesting though is the husband called me one day and said that his wife had said the next person they hire needed to be a woman. And so he knew that I was really passionate about this topic, right? Because I was very vocal about it. And he said, I'm kind of conflicted about that, and I wanted to talk to you about it. And he's like, what do you think? I said, I think that's a horrible idea. And he was like, really? He's like, that's really surprising to me. I said, well, let me explain why. I think it's a horrible idea because you're nothing more than a box checker if you do that. Because what you should hire for your next hire, for whatever role it is the most appropriate person that's going to be successful in that role. If you make an intentional choice, again, like don't confuse intentionality with box checking. If you make an intentional choice, the next person you hire will be a female or whatever dimension of diversity you defined in your context, you're going to get it wrong because you're not hiring a person for the role, you're hiring somebody based on like that dimension of diversity you're trying to fill. That person isn't going to be successful. You're not going to be able to foster their growth appropriately. They may have never been the appropriate candidate, but again, you were just box checking. So you were like, oh, female, flip the bit, come on in. And then guess what? They're probably the first one to leave when you look at retention. So be really, really careful, because I see this, I mean, big organizations do this a lot. They have quotas, and I know my brother-in-law, he's Cuban, and he was hired as part of meeting a quota for a very large company that I won't name. So he was super excited about it. I was excited for him, but he knew. He's like, I was hired because of the quota. And, it turns out he was successful there, but that isn't always the story. So you got to be really, really careful. Intentionality, don't confuse it with box checking. Like, just make sure, like, it's the right person for the role. So why is it important to keep people? Like, you can hire them, but you have to keep them there. And so part of that is making sure that they feel like they belong, that you invite challenge and curiosity. Remember I said, like, sitting at the table, everybody has a voice, and everybody in this room has a role there. It's not just leadership, right? Like, we can't just say, oh, it's management has to do that. Everybody, like, if Mary didn't talk in the Google Meet and it's 45 minutes in and she's the only person that hasn't spoke, maybe speak up and say, hey, Mary, what's your thoughts? Like, it's so simple, right? But we don't do it. That matters. And it matters, again, not just because it's a good thing to do, like, and it's altruistic, but it matters because of this metric. So 1.7 times, what is that? That is the amount of organizations that are seen as the most inclusive organizations are also market leaders. So if you're inclusive, truly inclusive, again, I'll talk about what that actually means and how do you know, you are 1.7 times more likely to be a leader in your market. Why is that? Well, because of what I said to you before, right? When you invite challenge and conflict, you get innovation. You're doing some incredible things because the outcome is always going to be better. You're not going to act on the first decision. You're going to argue and hash it out, and people are going to have all their different perspectives around the table. So that really, really matters for business reasons. So how do you know if your organization is inclusive? How many people here feel like they work in an inclusive organization? I actually do now. Oh, that's amazing. I've had leaders say, how do I know? And I said, you ask. And they're like, what do you mean? What do you mean I ask? I'm like, you ask. You ask one question. You send out, I don't care if you have 5 employees, 50 employees, or 5,000 employees, you send out a one-question survey to the entire team, and you say, do you ever feel like you have to strip away any part of who you are to come to work? Whether that's remote, in person, or whatever. Like, are you coming to work 100% authentically as yourself? If anyone feels like they can't do that, you're not inclusive. I don't care if 1 out of 50,000 people say, yeah, I kind of feel like I have to not be this part of me. You're not an inclusive organization. It's just one question. People don't ask. Why don't people ask? What do you guys think? Why don't people ask? Exactly. They are afraid. Because guess what? When one person says the answer they don't want, then they have a problem. And then they have to figure out what to do. This stuff really matters. So I highly encourage you, even like in your small groups, in your teams, ask. Like, because when people come to work authentically as themselves and they don't feel like they have to strip away part of who they are, you're getting better performance. Because I don't know about you, but when I don't have to pretend I'm 100% invested, right? It doesn't end up just being like a 9-to-5 job for me. It ends up being something that I truly want to see succeed, and I really dig in. Because it becomes part of my identity, right? Like it becomes like I am very proud of the work I'm doing and why. So this stuff really matters. So like we talked about before with gender and race, what you don't measure doesn't matter, right? Like, so you have to get real about these things. So the way I tell people to measure these things, it's a simple approach, right? The last 5 people you hired, what did they look like? Did they match that dimension of diversity and the goals that you defined? You got to ask yourself, because that means that maybe your practices on recruiting aren't quite working, right? And it's okay. That means you need to adjust. But if you don't look at it every once in a while, I would say every quarter at least, then you're not going to be doing the right things. You're really kind of just like talking the talk but not walking the walk, right? The last 5 people that got promoted, Melinda Gates said something, I think, back in the early 90s. There isn't a pipeline problem. She said the pipeline problem is bullshit. She's like, there's a pathways problem. There's plenty of women that are out there that it could be, they just aren't being promoted. And I think that's something we all need to look at, you know, and across all the dimensions of diversity. How are we promoting people? Because are we just in a leadership role? We know that we're dominated and not as diverse in leadership today across a lot of industries. So that means who gets promoted or who leadership promotes, which, by the way, I just told you a few minutes ago. We promote people that are look like us, that act like us, that we're comfortable with. Again, not because we're bad people, but because we're humans. And that's just generally what we're inclined to do. So we have to pay attention to that. So like, what's the last 5 people that were promoted in your team, your organization, et cetera? And then who's the last 5 people that left? Because remember, if you're checking boxes, those people that you did the box checking are probably in that list of the last 5 people that left. Like, what did they look like? Did they represent the dimension of diversity that you said were really important, that you're trying to culture and foster in your organization? Again, indicative of a problem. So if you don't pay attention to those things, even those 3 things, you're going to have problems and you're not going to know. Because we're going to feel really good that we're doing the right thing and we're checking boxes and we feel good and we talk about diversity and inclusion, but like, are we actually doing the work? Are we being intentional? You don't know unless you measure it. So again, just recapping, what are the steps on this journey that you might be able to take when you leave this room today? You know, define diversity, what it means for you and all the different dimensions. It's overwhelming, but it's okay, I promise. It's if you take these steps and you're not gonna get it wrong. Avoid diversity debt because you're already behind. Just start now. Start thinking about it now. Start thinking about how you want to grow your team, how you want to support other people already on your team, too, so that they don't leave. Start at the top. Create a culture of challenge and curiosity, and that is across everybody, not just the leadership team. I find a lot people just wait and depend on leadership to do the right thing. Please don't do that. I'm in leadership. I represent a leadership role, and sometimes we're dumb. Like, help us. You know, call things out and challenge us. We need it. Measure things, like I just said, like the last 5 people you hired, last 5 people promoted, last 5 people that left. Like, even in that simplistic state, it's going to tell you a lot about what you're doing or not doing for your team. And then just rinse and repeat, because I hate to tell you, but you don't just get to do this once. It's forever. Like, as long as you're in business, these things have to be done, right? It's, again, like being intentional. This should just become part of what you do. Just like when you come to work and you have a project and you have milestones and deliverables, this is part of what you do. I think the challenge is, what we see is that who owns it? I hear that a lot. Like, well, who owns this? Like, all of us. You know, it's like, well, then we should have like a DEI officer. I'm like, okay, sure, but I've also seen when we do that, sometimes it also doesn't work because it can't be the responsibility of one individual, right? It doesn't work. One person can't solve it. If it could, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I wouldn't have been so frustrated that I co-founded Diversify Thinking, because we would have been making all sorts of progress, because I was one woman championing women in tech and everything would have just worked, right? It just doesn't work that way. We need everybody around the table to make real change happen. And that's a little bit about me if you want to connect, because obviously I love to talk and I could talk about this stuff all the time, amongst other things. If you are local in the Northeast ever, please connect with me as well. We hold some events, again, targeted specifically for women, and just focusing on growth and maturity there. But we also are looking to expand that to bring lots of different perspectives around the table. So I'm very happy to connect with all of you. I really thank you guys, and I'm open. I think we have like maybe 1 minute for questions. Yeah, no, that's a great question. A big question, too. So I don't know if you guys all heard the question, but essentially it's like you're in a state of diversity debt, and how do you like basically position to a point where you can get people to actually care? Essentially, like, so I'm a big fan of data, and I think data helps you there. But from your story, the anecdote, I would say that company probably just isn't the right place to be doing that. I think, like, and that's the truth too, right? Like, I think people also, again, fear comes into play. People are afraid to speak up because what you might learn is that company isn't for you, right? Like, if that's something that's important to you and they're not willing to help or foster that environment, it might be like time to move on. But I think data, again, like data is a big proponent for being able to argue for that. Like, what are the business metrics or the value that you can bring to the table to try to shift the tide? But it's hard. It's not an easy shift. Again, like, you have to have leadership that's open to it as well, and I think they have to also see proof. There's a lot of people, like, especially when you have diversity debt, so you're already sort of that far along. And I mean, there's lots of studies too that in regards to equality of pay between men and women, and especially like women of color as well. Like, it's so imbalanced, and people are trying to make that aligned, but you know, I think unless we have a systemic change, it's just not going to happen. It's going to be really difficult, one corporation at a time. So I would say data and making sure it's the right environment that's going to support that, because otherwise you're sort of like going to be running into walls constantly, and that's not going to obviously help. But as a small company that's looking to grow, avoiding it by like equity of pay from the beginning is a big decision, and also something that takes intentionality and work. And I think, again, like, I don't know how in today's day and age you can defend that you would pay someone for the same exact job, regardless of, again, like, take the name off the resume. Why would you pay them 75 cents on the dollar? Makes no sense. Like, it doesn't make sense. They're clearly qualified. You've picked them for the role. They deserve to be compensated for the value that they're delivering. I mean, that's, to me, there's no reason why one would be paid more than the other for the exact same role. So I'm sorry that I didn't give you a very like prescriptive answer, but that's the challenge with this stuff, right? It's not that prescriptive, but I do think that data is a big asset, because some of those people that are very focused on like driving the bottom line, like, that's all they care about. So they don't necessarily have the altruistic motivation to do the right thing. But again, remember, it's not just about doing the right thing. It's really the right thing for the business to be able to succeed long term and sustain that. Yeah, I'm also very passionate about that, because I happen to be like the oldest person at my company. So, which is in the startup space is, you know, pretty typical. But I'll tell you that I'm also seeing such a great dynamic between myself on the older side and then, you know, some of the people that I'm hiring that are, you know, early career, because they are challenging me. That's creating growth for me and a great best opportunity for the company as a whole. And I think Manfred's giving a talk actually on generational diversity, which I'm excited about going to see as well. So I recommend seeing that, because I think he'll dive a lot deeper in there. But again, that's a dimension of diversity as well, like age. And I think that ageism is a thing, right? I think it's also, it's interesting because I've also worked with people that are older than I am at different organizations, and I think it's sort of like you could have someone that's older and really open to different opinions and learning still, like, and then you could have someone that's older and very set in their ways, right? So it's like the actual personality combined with the age, I think, is where you have to like pay attention, because it's not just about what are they younger, are they older, it's about how open are they to being challenged, to working through conflict, to not being like, well, I'm older, so you should just listen to me and do what I say, right? So I think like that's not my approach, but I will be honest, I've worked with people that are my age or older that definitely feel like what does this, 23-year-old think that they are gonna tell me? And I'm like, well, maybe listen. They might be telling you something that you don't actually know. So I think that's part of it too, is like us being open to being challenged, even by people that are early in their career, because we may learn something. Did you have a question? Yeah, no, it's interesting. It also depends on where you are in the world, because I will say like there's some, in the US we've had a big challenge, right, with like the decline of women, especially in tech, coming out of colleges, and where we see that drop off too. Again, I feel like it's such a personal and unique thing to each company. To say like 80-20 or 50-50, I think it depends on where you are now, right? So I think you have to, again, measure where you want to get to, but you also always have to check the gauge of where you are now. Because are you 98% male? Well, then maybe you need to up the game, so maybe you do want to get to 50-50 by 2026 or whatever. But are you already, like, we're actually, our diverse ratio is really, really nice, at least on the gender side right now. So I would say for us, it's really maintaining, so it really, I think you have to look at where you are now and understand, and then adjust. So I think that's the important thing too, like you define that goal and what you want to measure, but then in 3 months, maybe you achieve that goal, and then you're like, okay, what's next, right? So, okay, we did the thing with the gender, we feel really good, we're very, we've had that, but we don't have a lot of other diversity. Like, what's the next thing that we want to approach and build? And, and again, that's also understanding where you are. So are you guys talking to the people on your team? Do you know the level of diversity that you have beyond what you can see? So I think really you can't prescribe, should it be 80-20, should it be 50-50, until you understand where you're at. And then again, that can change. Like, don't set a milestone in a ratio and then just go blindly ahead for the next decade, because that's not going to serve you either, right? You're going to end up with a different set of problems. Yeah, that's a great question, right? Because there's bias, right? So they came from somewhere where they weren't allowed to speak up. So it's like, how do we get them to come out of their shell? Like, it's okay. And that's really tough, and I love that question. So thank you so much for asking that, because I think it's like, how do we create a culture of belonging where people do feel like it's safe, like they're psychologically safe to be at work and be themselves? Again, I think it's really up to, I think that I do put partly on leadership, but also, your peers, to invite people to be able to offer their opinion. Like, you need to be very vocal about recognizing when people aren't speaking up and be intentional about asking them to. One of the things that we do for new employees, which I love, which by the way took some negotiation, because my leadership team, they're all based in Europe, and so they told me that this was just an American thing, my idea. And I was like, actually, don't think so, but okay. But I'll take it as long as you guys will let us try. So what we did was, as we hire new employees, we have an onboarding form we have them fill out. And I ask questions. I say I'm not even in charge of people ops, but I sort of influenced it. But like, we ask questions where we say, how do you like to receive praise? Do you like to receive praise publicly, privately? Not at all. Like, I don't care if I did a good job. Do not tell me or anyone else that I do good. Because some people don't like that, right? How do you like to be celebrated for special events, like your anniversary here at work or your birthday? And like, you guys, people were like, what is this, not Club Med? Why are we asking people these questions? I said, because we want people to feel like we actually care about who they are as individuals, and that we understand how they want to be acknowledged, be communicated with. Another question we ask, because this is really important, especially like when you look at Myers-Briggs and different personality types, what's the most productive time of work for you? Like, is it the morning? Is it the evening? Is it like the afternoon? When's the best time that like you'd want to be in a meeting? Because I can't tell you how many people I've scheduled meetings with like later in the day, And I'm like, wow, this person hates me. I'm like, oh my God, there's just not, and I'll have a very direct conversation. I'll be like, are you happy here? I feel like there's something. It's like, no, but you always schedule this meeting with me at 4 o'clock. Like, okay, I won't do that anymore. What time would you like to meet? So, but like understanding how each person really wants to work with you. Like, and that, I think that partly does fall on us from a leadership perspective. And honestly, I see such huge benefits from it. Every employee that's filled out that survey that I had to sort of argue with my European colleagues for have said, I really felt like I made the right decision joining this company when I filled out that survey. They already felt like they belonged. They already felt like we were listening and that we cared. So I think I'm out of time, but sorry, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, something that you could easily do is, if you're already working at that company, it's really being vocal so that women will see themselves in you. So if you're working at the company and you're like, I want more of me here, or more people here, then being vocal and being out there, getting out in the community and the spaces where those women are, or whatever the dimension of diversity, right? Like being vocal in those spaces will show people that your company cares. And so all of a sudden you're like, oh, I mean, it's like any other branding exercise, right? Like if we're looking at a target market, we have to show up there. We have to show up there to attract that customer base. Otherwise, they don't even know we exist, right? So, and that's really true of startups too, right? Like people don't know yet. We need brand awareness. You need brand awareness when you're attracting employees of a particular dimension of diversity. So, I mean, what I've given people advice, and this has worked for a lot of people too, is like find the Slack groups, like Out in Tech, like we did a lot of posting in Out in Tech, or other groups like that, like attract people. Go to meetups, there's millions, depending, no matter where you are in the world, where you can go to like women in tech meetups. You could Google it or use ChatGPT, I suppose. You will find a set of those that you could attend, and I think if it's something you're passionate about, you can go and do that and be an evangelist for your company too. That goes a long way. That goes a long way beyond, I mean, listen, like what 90% of jobs are through like networking and referrals. So like if someone sees and can relate to you, then they're gonna wanna at least investigate working at your company. So that would be my advice. Like get out there in the community, have your company visible in those spaces where those people that you're trying to attract are. Okay, I think they're really gonna make me get down now. Thank you so much, you guys.